rumor has it. Three enticing words that almost never lead to anything good. The latest example, Ilya Shapiro, conservative lawyer and author, spread a rumor about Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito. Have a listen.
I heard a rumor that Justice Alito and his family have been taken to an undisclosed location, and he's the author of this leaked draft.
I've heard that Justice Alito has been taken to an undisclosed location with his family.
Conservatives lost their minds. Right-wing media was flooded with headlines that just ran with it as if it was fact, because I guess some conservative talking head talked about it. Senator Ted Cruz even shared an article from townhall.com that cites an article from Breitbart that cites Ilya Shapiro's rumor. No apologies from Cruz for that, but that is the right-wing echo chamber in a nutshell. And it's baseless. It's all baseless. By the way, even if Justice Alito had been moved to an undisclosed location for his safety, it wouldn't necessarily mean there were actual threats against him following his draft opinion that would overturn Roe v. Wade. It might just be that Alito or people around him are being cautious. But again, completely unverified rumor. Being cautious? Think about being cautious. Ilya Shapiro wasn't cautious. On Monday, he confirmed that he couldn't confirm a thing about his claim. He told Politico, quote, he actually wasn't sure if what he said was true. Quote, I don't have any non-public sources, he said. There's a quote for you. I don't have any non-public sources. I forget where I saw the rumor on Twitter, he continued, or somebody told me. I don't know. I don't know. You'd expect a conservative legal scholar to have some semblance of responsibility when it comes to spreading pretty serious, high-profile claims. Then again, this is the man who Georgetown University put on leave from his administrative post there after he tweeted in January that thanks to Joe Biden, we were going to get, a quote, a lesser black woman on the Supreme Court. So that's who the conservative source is for their news. The reason why Shapiro's rumor is so important is that his unbacked claim has been wedged into so many discussions about the peaceful abortion rights protests that we've seen in recent days outside the homes of a number of Supreme Court justices. Protests took place outside Samuel Alito's home in Virginia on Monday. They followed protests outside Justice Kavanaugh and Chief Justice Roberts' homes in the D.C. area over the weekend. The right keeps suggesting these demonstrations are dangerous, even though there's no evidence of any violence or threats so far. The organizers say they're nothing more than people expressing genuine, heartfelt outrage that the court might strip the rights of millions of women in America. Some point to the irony of justices demanding privacy while about to rule against the right to privacy in the context of abortion. Still, are these protests the best move for liberals and the left? Should the homes of public figures where their families and kids live be off limits? And how might liberals and the left react if right-wingers showed up at the home of, say, Justice Sotomayor to protest an opinion of hers? Or is context, in this case, everything? With me now to discuss all of this and more, Michelle Goldberg, New York Times columnist, and Brittany Packnett-Cunningham, activist and host of the Undistracted podcast. Both are MSNBC political analysts and friends of the show. Thank you both for joining me. Michelle, let me start with you. You're pro-choice. How do you feel about these pro-choice protests outside the homes of these three conservative justices?
I feel ambivalent. I think that, look, I think there's a huge amount of hypocrisy and, frankly, whining. You saw Susan Collins call the police because somebody had chalked something on the sidewalk near her house. Here's the thing that does give me pause. Most of the jurisprudence on protesting outside someone's home is because of how often the anti-abortion movement has targeted abortion providers. I mean, that's partly why the right's stance on this is so hypocritical. But I also think that there is some value in sort of recognizing a norm against doing this, given how often it's used specifically against abortion providers, and then more recently during the COVID pandemic outside the homes of public health officials.
Brittany, do you agree with that?
So I have a slightly different take. And as you said before, Mehdi, I do think that context matters deeply here, specifically the context of being a public official. Look, there are 9 folks who get to sit on that bench and they get to make decisions about all of us. And in particular, 5 of them, more of them are making decisions about my ability to have autonomy over my body. Obviously, the irony of the right to privacy is a thread that goes throughout this whole thing. But I also recognize that abortion providers are not people who were appointed and confirmed by the U.S. Senate. And it's different when we are talking about official public servants. I also want us to recognize what protest is in the first place. It is designed to create discomfort. I think that it has been fascinating watching folks from the right and also from the left denounce this kind of behavior as if a protest is supposed to make us comfortable. The point is to create discomfort. The point, as Dr. King talked about in his letter from a Birmingham jail, was to create the crisis that would force powers that be to the negotiating table. Civility, order, politeness, these are vestiges of white supremacy culture that frankly have held us back for far too long.
Brittany, you make a good point distinguishing between abortion providers and public officials. But then just to take that argument to the next, the logical conclusion, I mentioned Sotomayor in the intro. Would you then be okay with conservatives turning up at Justice Sotomayor's house because they didn't like an opinion of hers, which they believed was stripping them of their rights?
I mean, to be clear, personally, I wouldn't love it. And I do think that we have to draw a distinction between folks who are protesting for freedom and democracy, people who are trying to protect the privacy and the rights of the most marginalized, and people who are showing up to protest, the right to not wear masks and put other people in harm's way, right? There's a difference between those who are protesting for the rights of the marginalized and those who are complaining about their inability to harm others and be exclusive. But I also recognize that Sonia Sotomayor probably understood the ask that was being made of her when she stood up to decide to take on this important work. And we also recognize that Supreme Court justices have additional access to security measures that the rest of us as private citizens do not. So would I love it? No. But do I think that Justice Sotomayor probably understood that this comes with the territory and that within reason that is to be expected? I think that's probably true.
So, Michelle, just picking up on Brittany's point on coming with the territory and public officials, you made a good point that one of the reasons the jurisprudence around this, it comes from people protesting at abortion clinics, abortion providers' homes. We know that abortion providers have been killed in the past. But couldn't that also be used in reverse? Couldn't a protester say to you, Michelle, well, it's because they did it. I know we're into like whataboutism and who started it territory. But this argument that if Republicans are doing it anyways, because I hear a lot of people saying, well, what happens when Republicans turn up? Well, Republicans already turned up at Jocelyn Benson's house in Michigan with guns after the election to protest the Michigan confirmation. They already turned up outside the houses of school board members in Maine, in Florida, and multiple other states. So what would you say to an activist who said to you, Michelle, you're 100% right, but, it's already happening, so why shouldn't there be some parity? Why shouldn't there be a level playing field?
I would say a couple of things. I would say, one, if you think it's, sort of not a good and useful tactic when they do it, then saying, why can't we do it too? Or it's okay when we do it. Or what about is an argument that's not going to be convincing to anyone who doesn't share all of your preconceptions. I also sort of think that the very fact that we're doing this segment, right, that the tactic itself has become the locus of controversy rather than this extremely outrageous decision that's going to strip women of constitutional rights that most of us have grown up taking somewhat for granted, I think is the sign of a tactic that is maybe backfiring. I mean, look, I don't really want to control these people. I don't think it's the biggest deal one way or the other. I live in Brooklyn. Yeah. The reason that I know where Chuck Schumer lives is because of the constant protests outside of his apartment building. I do think that we should be cognizant of the way that protesting outside of, private homes specifically is far more often used to intimidate people who the right doesn't like. And you're right that they're not going to stop doing it just because progressives hesitate. But I nevertheless think it makes it harder to even make the argument for that as a norm if we say that it's okay when we do it. So, Brittany, Michelle made a good point about we're talking about the tactic, and it's not just us talking about the tactic. Democrats are also talking about the tactic. Jen Psaki, White House press secretary, said on Monday, and let me read to you the quote, POTUS strongly believes in the constitutional right to protest, but that should never include violence, threats, or vandalism. They have to be able to do their jobs without concern for personal safety. Was that an important statement to make as things may get heated, or is that Democrats feeding into a right-wing narrative that the protests are dangerous?
a lawless mob, as Ted Cruz put it.
I absolutely think it's feeding into an incorrect and thus far unproven narrative that there has been violence and threats and more at these protests. Just showing up at somebody's house to make your voice heard, a public official's house, does not inherently imply a threat of violence. I think what we have to recognize is that it's easy to paint the protesters themselves and lay the blame at the protesters' feet for changing the conversation and focusing us on a tactic. But it's much harder, even though it's much more true, to recognize that America has consistently prioritized order over justice. This is the reason why we're out here in the first place. Dr. King would often chastise leaders, civic leaders, who would come to him and ask him to calm down the Black community, because he would say, until you are concerned with the actual source of their frustration, until you are concerning yourselves with why people are protesting in the first place, I'm not going to go out and demean the people on my side. And frankly, I wish the Democratic Party would do the same. When this decision was leaked, I got texts, emails, phone calls, and more from the Democratic Party asking for my donation. So if you can use my rage to fundraise, you can certainly understand when I use my rage to protest.
But what about Michelle's point a moment ago that people are not talking about the substance of the decision because they're instead debating the tactic?
Absolutely. But I'm saying that that's not the fault of the protester. That's the fault of a white supremacist culture in America that continues to prioritize politeness where protest has actually got to be the name of the game. It is very, very easy to put the blame on the most marginalized people and to say that we are in the wrong. However, there is an opportunity for us to look at systems and stop letting systems off the hook where it's easier to put the blame on individuals. So I understand that notion, but I think that we have to look beyond the individual to the systems that have pushed people to this point.
Michelle, these protests led on Monday to the Senate unanimously passing legislation, really fast. It's funny how fast the Senate can move when it wants to, that would increase security for Supreme Court justices. The bill's headed to the House next. You wrote a piece last week titled "The Death of Roe is going to Tear America Apart." And you write, the demise of Roe will exacerbate America's antagonisms. From who you've spoken to, the reporting you've done, do you get the sense that the climate in America, especially if Roe is in fact overturned, that things are going to become more hostile, more polarized, more violent even, dare I say?
I think that there's very little question that things will become more hostile and polarized, in part because a lot of states are passing laws that seek to go beyond their own borders. You know, there's a proposal, not a law, but a proposal in Missouri that would allow Missourians to sue people in other states who help people from Missouri get abortions. You know, in Texas, you can technically be extradited to Texas if you send someone in Texas abortion pills. Connecticut, meanwhile, has just passed the opposite sort of law, a law to protect people in Connecticut from legal retribution from other states if they help women get abortions in Connecticut or perform abortions in Connecticut. And so you're going to have this kind of situation that you haven't, according to one of the legal scholars I spoke to, had really since the fugitive slave laws, that where you have these radically different legal regimes in different states and these sort of lawsuits and questions of jurisdiction and, you know, people. I mean, just imagine what happens when, you know, Texas tries to extradite someone from a blue state. You know, I wrote in the piece, like, you think that we hate each other now, wait till we see that sort of thing.
Indeed. Last very quick question to you, Brittany, if we're out of time. You've made a very eloquent case today about it goes with the territories, public officials, but just in terms of private settings. Last quick question. Democratic mayor of Boston, who is not white, Michelle Wu, new mayor, progressive. She had the Boston City Council adopt her resolution that restricts the hours that protesters can hold demonstrations at private residences because she had anti-vaxxers with loudspeakers protesting outside her house for weeks at 7 o'clock in the morning. Would you sympathize with her, or would you say it goes with the terrain?
I certainly sympathize with her. I also recognize some of this goes with the terrain. However, and this is why I always say context deeply matters. When anti-vaxxers are out there without masks on during a global pandemic, that is a public health crisis. So all of those folks that are living on that block, all of the people walking up and down that street who are trying to take their kids to school, there is a different set of circumstances that that mayor is dealing with. I don't believe that there should be a carte blanche law created about that, but I do recognize once again that context should always matter here. And ultimately, if we're talking about violence and we are talking about a Supreme Court that is willing to remove my control over my own body and allow some states to put me in jail if I exercise that right, that is the violence that we should always be discussing.